this working? I am Edith Stokey, lecturer in public policy and secretary of the Kennedy School of Government. I'm privileged to welcome you all tonight to this opening session in the second annual Oliver Cromwell Cox lecture series. Last year, when the lectures began, they were frankly experimental. We hoped that they would attract enough support from students, faculty, and the wider university to warrant continuing them this year. We needn't have worried. The Cox lectures succeeded beyond the most extravagant expectations, both as to their substance and as to the enthusiasm with which they were met. I look forward to this year's series with relaxed anticipation. As always, the Kennedy School is most grateful to the scholars and practitioners who have so willingly agreed to participate in these panel discussions. We all know how valuable and how scarce your free evenings are. We're all familiar with the request that begins, "It's only one night." I hope that the urgency of the issues under discussion and the depth of our interest in them will reward you. I'm particularly pleased to have this chance to express the Kennedy School's faculty's appreciation to the Kennedy School Black Caucus. The organization and management of the Cox lectures have been a textbook lesson in student initiative, persistence, and dedication. That was true last year. It has been true again this year. Believe me, the faculty are well aware of what you have accomplished, and we are filled with admiration and respect and indeed envy. Race and equality are central concerns in our society. We are all indebted to the Black Caucus for focusing our attention on several different aspects of these issues in a systematic and constructive way, thereby deepening our insights and strengthening our commitment to effective policies that will promote justice and equality for all. Now I am pleased to turn the microphone over to Lehman Abrams, who is chairman of the co-chairman of the Kennedy School Black Caucus.
On behalf of the Black Caucus of the John F. Kennedy School of Government, I warmly welcome you to the second Oliver Cromwell Cox lecture series. This lecture series was created to raise issues of concern in a scholarly format, augment the school's efforts to recruit black faculty and staff, and to sensitize the entire community to minority concerns. Recognizing the influential role that Harvard School of Government plays in the development of a new profession for public service, we feel it is crucial that the school incorporate into its research and teaching mission issues of importance to the black community. In the tradition of many black scholars, we as black students are interested in understanding the causes of racial inequality, and more importantly, as the theme indicates, in developing strategies to eliminate those inequities. One of the many black scholars to tackle these issues is the person whom our lecture series honors, Oliver Cromwell Cox. An economist and sociologist by training, he directed much of his scholarly research in an attempt to understand and explain the continual underclass position of Black Americans. In his monumental work, Caste, Class, and Race, A Study in Social Dynamics, published in 1948, he rejected the notion that the position of blacks in this country can be reduced to the mere facts of prejudice, bigotry, and the mistreatment of one group by another. Rather, it must be viewed as an inherent part of the capitalist system. Recognizing the interrelationships between racial inequality and modern capitalism was not a very popular position at the time. And it is quite ironic that Cox, perhaps one of the soundest thinkers of the first generation of Black sociologists, was accorded only negative recognition during most of his long academic career. Despite little public recognition or financial support, he continued to pursue his original direction in looking for the real causes of inequality. He received the Du Bois Award in 1968 for his contributions to sociology. The Black Caucus of the Kennedy School honors this great Black scholar because of his efforts aimed at understanding social inequality and for challenging accepted practices and beliefs. For we believe only by critically analyzing old concepts can new ones be uncovered. Only by questioning the realities of today will we develop strategies for tomorrow. It is our hope, our intent, that upon leaving this forum, you will not only come to know the sentiments and opinions of the panelists, but more importantly, you will have an idea of what role you can play, what we can do to improve the conditions of Black Americans in this country. For if we, students, practitioners, and professionals, here and countrywide, fail to take hold at this critical juncture and act, I ask you, who will? Before beginning tonight's proceedings, a few announcements. After expressing a desire to participate in tonight's proceedings, Congressman Walter Fauntroy and Special Assistant Thaddeus Garrett were unable to attend due to conflicts in their schedule. The Oliver Cromwell Cox Lecture Series continues for the next 2 Thursdays in March. The March 11th panel, The Media and the Black Perspective, includes panel members Percy Sutton, Chairman of Inner City Broadcast, Dr. Gilbert Maddox, President of City Communications, a Detroit-based broadcasting station, Darlene Tolbert, former manager of White House Minority Telecommunications, Riley Temple, Communications Counsel, U.S. Senate. The March 18th panel, The Reaganomics, Impact on Black Economic Mobility. The panelists are yet to be confirmed. The second announcement is that there is a reception immediately following the panel discussion in the penthouse. Thirdly, I'd like to introduce an honored guest here this evening, Augustus A. Adair, who is chairman of the Political Science Department at Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland. He's former executive director of the Congressional Caucus and campaign advisor for Perrin Mitchell from 1968 to the present. We're glad and honored that he took the time to participate in the panel discussion. I'll introduce the moderator. The moderator for this evening is Walter Brodnicks. He has served as Principal Deputy Assistant of the Federal Department of Health and Human Services, has been a consultant in such areas as manpower training, correctional services, and education. An expert in organizational theory and behavior, and in public administration in general. He is presently a lecturer in public policy here at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. We are pleased to have him moderate tonight's proceedings. Professor Brodnicks.
Thank you very much, Layman. I think the enterprise that we're engaged in here this evening, without a doubt, in all of our minds, is extremely important. In some of our minds, it is preeminently important. I also think it's fair to say that blacks in America believe that once again there is a challenge being posed in terms of the level or degree of our participation in the political process. I think it's also fair to say that we recognize that the challenge is not new, nor have the stakes necessarily changed. Taking this then as a given, what seem to be some potentially efficacious responses to this challenge, to our participation? What seem to be some viable strategies that blacks might pursue in meeting these challenges? And what must black Americans contemplate if we are not prepared to meet the challenges of the 1980s? I think it is fair to say that the panelists we have here with us this evening, I'm sure, will give us insights not only into the issues that I have posed in relationship to our topic this evening, which is blacks and the political process, but even more issues as well. Let me begin then by introducing our panelists for the evening, and I will do this seriatim, and then call the first panelist forward. In order, the Honorable Kenneth Blackwell, seated in the middle, who is City Councilman for the City of Cincinnati since 1977. Formerly, he served as Vice Mayor and Mayor of that same city. He is also Chairman, National League of Cities Local Legislators Committee, and Vice Chairman of the Economic Development Committee of the United States Conference of Mayors. To Mr. Blackwell's left is the Honorable Johnny Ford, who is Mayor of Tuskegee, Alabama since 1972. He is the former Vice President, National Conference of Black Mayors, and the former Chairman of the Alabama Conference of Mayors. Seated nearest me is Ms. Diane Penderhughes, who is currently a guest scholar at the Brookings Institution and an assistant professor of government at Dartmouth College. She received her PhD degree in political science at the University of Chicago. Her major teaching fields and study fields are American politics, urban politics, black politics, and public policy. Her publications include Urban Policy, which is included in the Encyclopedia of Policy Studies, Black Power, The Failure of an Ideology, and Black Politics, Problems and Prospects. At this point, I would like to have the Honorable Kenneth Blackwell come forward. Ken?
Thank you, Walter. It's a pleasure to be with you all this evening. I must say from the start that Walter was very explicit in his pre-presentation directions. He gave us very definitive and strict timelines upon which to work within. And I guess he knew, generally speaking, former mayors are generally speaking. So I will try my best, Walter, to stay within those time constraints. One of my charges this evening is to help delineate, for those of you who might not already be aware of the differences between conservatives and liberals and their various approaches to the issues that confront the black community. I was remembering this evening something that the fine senator, depending on your point of view, from California, Howard Taylor used to say when trying to distinguish between liberals and conservatives. He said that a conservative was the person who would see a man drowning 75 feet offshore and throw him a 50-foot rope because the swim was doing good, while a liberal was a person who would see that same person drowning 50 feet offshore and throw him a 100-foot rope and then drop his end to go off to do something else good. What the black community is looking for, hopefully, are people who would throw 50-foot ropes and hold on to their end. I think anytime you're talking about an agenda or a direction, we should keep in mind the old African proverb, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. In that vein, I would like to at least list 5 goals and strategies that I see as being important to the black community in the decade of the 80s. You must forgive me if I have derived these goals and strategies from my particular experience and now apply them in a very general way. But I think one of the first objectives of the black community in the decade of the 80s is to recognize and use effectively the diversity of leadership that exists in the black community and among the masses of black people. For all too long, we have labored under the myth that the black community is monolithic in its political perspective, that we are all the same in terms of our material existence and our objective interests. We are a very diverse community, and we have diverse leadership, and in the decade of the 80s, I think we should take advantage of that diversity. In an attempt to find common ground, that leads me to my second goal or strategy, and that is to continue to combat the negative constraints that reduce opportunities for black people. Regardless of whether or not we're a liberal or conservative, Democrat or Republican, or a member of the Socialist Workers' Party, as black people, we all have a common interest in eliminating those negative constraints that limit our opportunities. It would seem to me that as far as black leadership is concerned, this is a special responsibility, and I think it is a key to political success, in that one of our major problems in the black community will be this widening of the gulf between the black masses and those of us who have arrived, at least to a certain extent, to middle class or middle income brackets, and I want to score middle income brackets. And I think that is important in attempting to find ways to dissipate and eliminate these negative constraints. I think it will keep us focused on a reality that while some of us have arrived at the station of middle income brackets, we are, for the most part, 2 or 3 paychecks away from poverty ourselves. It would seem to me that this is a reality that we should never lose contact with, and that we have a special interest in closing the gap that might be the income gap that might be widening between the black haves and the black have-nots. To the degree that we have a weak link, we all are vulnerable. Third, just from our practical experience, it would seem to me that we have to increase political participation, and this has to really go beyond just massive voter education and registration drives during election seasons. It would seem to me that most black people who are not participating in the political process do so because, or don't participate because they don't see what the fruits of their efforts would be at the end of the process. It is a very rational and logical decision not to participate when you can't see what that participation would produce. The question is, and the challenge is for black political leadership, is to show what that participation would mean. This is one of the reasons why I don't reject out of hand at least some of the aspects of Reagan's new federalism. I happen to believe that the notion of government that governs best is perhaps the government closest to the problem is not too far-fetched and has an emotional appeal that we should take advantage of. I really don't think that the notion of no taxation without proper representation is a notion that goes unheard in the black community. It would seem to me that when you look at the problems that riddle and confront our community, there are problems that will have a local solution. Crime, inferior education, housing. You can go right down the line, and it seems to me that we have to make it clear, we have to make it structurally clear to the black community that their participation in the local political process can have a direct impact. Our present intergovernmental system is so overloaded on the federal level that most people, black and white, are confused when it comes to trying to determine who to hold accountable. We have, as a consequence of various interpretations of the Constitution and various political strategies, we've shifted costs as well as responsibilities for local decision-making to Washington. I think getting some of that authority back home would enhance the possibility of more black people participating in the political process. The fourth issue would be increased economic independence. It is quite clear, as far as I'm concerned, that there is a correlation between economic independence and political independence. It would seem to me that we, as a community, have to realize that all of the empirical data would suggest that we will not close the gaps, we will not reduce income disparities that exist if we are not in a growth economy, a balanced growth, that is. Therefore, I think our economic strategies have to be focused towards growth, and we have to embrace a national economic strategy that has economic growth as its principal or central objective. So I guess those of us who are inclined to think that the major issue of the 80s is a question of whether or not black people are Republicans or Democrats, whether or not black people are liberals or conservatives, are going to have to come quickly to an understanding that the issue is not which group of political elites realizes ideological hegemony, the so-called new black conservatives or the so-called established black leadership, but it is a matter of who can respond to the needs and aspirations of black people. So I would guess that probably presents an opening for people like myself who, even though Jimmy Carter has perhaps soiled our label, I'm still proud to be a zigzag pragmatist. I think that in the final analysis, It is that kind of pragmatic effort and work and outlook that will address the needs of black people. We can go on, but I'm sure basically the question and answer period will draw out your particular questions. You know, I would say that I think Frederick Douglass said it more clear than most people. In this country, you might not get all that you pay for, but you must pay for all that you get. I think and I will summarize or at least state indirectly what he said when he stated that those people who fail to appreciate agitation, who run away from controversy, or like people who want rain without thunder and lightning, they want crops without working the soil. He went on to say that power concedes nothing without a demand. That leads me to believe that the overriding issue is the issue of participation, participation in the change process, and I think that that is at least the overriding objective of those 4 strategies or goals that I have outlined for you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with the other panel members this evening and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
As I said, we'll move through the panel seriatim. Therefore, and hold your questions, and if you care to, please jot them down so that when the panel is finished, we might move actively into the question and answer period. At this point, I'd like to introduce the Honorable Johnny Ford, Mayor of Tuskegee.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brodnicks, and to my fellow panelists, and to all of you for braving the cold. I understand this is typical for up south. Happy to be up here with you all. Let's give Brother Adair a round of applause. He's very modest, but he's done so much with our caucus, and just delighted to have him here. I first want to express my sincerest appreciation for inviting me to participate in this, the second annual Oliver Cromwell Cox series. I think it's very fitting and appropriate that you should have such a series, and I'm just certainly so proud to have been invited and to be able to bring you greetings on behalf of the people and the organizations whom I'm privileged to represent. So first, I greet you on behalf of the people of Tuskegee, Alabama, the pride of the swift-growing South, home of Tuskegee Institute, which has been declared by Congress, the Congress of the United States, as a National Historic Site for Black Education and Accomplishment in America. So I invite you to come and walk upon the sacred and the hallowed grounds of Tuskegee Institute and have your souls embellished by the spirit of Booker T. Washington and Dr. George Washington Carver, still lives and thrives. Black folk, if you want to go to heaven when you die, you must come by Tuskegee. Seriously, I'm also very honored to greet you today on behalf of our national president, Dr. Joseph Eckers Lowry, the Southern Christian Leadership, and Congressman Fauntleroy, the chairman of our board, as a member of the national board of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. If there was ever a need for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, that need is here today. For someone must say to America that we can't take it anymore, that we are not going to let anyone take our freedom from us, and that we will not sit idly by and let the dream and the quest for freedom and justice, the dream of Dr. Martin Luther King, go unrealized. And so the quest to extend the Voting Rights Act is just one of the critical issues that SCLC is involved in. And I want to say to you that we must not be satisfied until the Voting Rights Act is extended, and I mean extended in a strong and viable form, which will ensure that the voting rights of all Americans are assured and protected. You would have to live down in Pickens County, Alabama, in the backwoods of Georgia to really realize that there are still atrocities going on in terms of depriving poor blacks and poor whites and people who are blind and cannot read and write, depriving them of their right to vote. This is a very critical issue that we are concerned about, and we just completed a 160-mile march across Alabama, from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, where thousands converged. We are going to bring that movement to the nation's capital and try to send a message to the Congress and to the United States that we are not satisfied. Further, let me greet you as Vice President of the National Conference of Black Mayors, and we'll be moving toward the presidency, we hope, in the annual meeting. We are very proud, the National Conference of Black Mayors, for it is an organization of some 205 mayors in this nation who are black. And I'm sure that my fellow mayors would want me to say today that if you were traveling through any of our cities, any of our 205 cities, you could be assured that you would not have to worry about some racist police officer pulling you out of the car and beating you across the head and giving you a ticket. Now, we'll give you a ticket, but we'll give it to you with a smile. But we want you to know that our mayors greet you and would want me to say to those of you here at Harvard who represent the cream of the cream in terms of the future leadership of this country, they would want me to say and invite you to come to their respective cities and to cast down your buckets where you are. I'd like to touch very briefly this evening on your subject, strategies for moving into the 80s for blacks through the political process. Very timely. You've asked me to address several topics, the new conservatism, liberalism, the new right, black republicanism, the role of black politicians, and finally, where do we go from here? Where's the roadmap? Is there light at the end of the tunnel? Is there hope through this Reaganomics and through the maze of the 80s? First of all, you've asked me to address the status of black political leadership and black politics in America today. Had it not been for the Voting Rights Act, we certainly would not be where we are in terms of having the number of blacks who elected to office. There are well over some 3,000 blacks, but that is still less than 1% of the elected officials in this nation. We have blacks who are serving in elected offices from the Congress to the state to the local level, in appointed offices in the administration from the national down to the state and to the local level. But still, we're serving too little in terms of being an intricate part of the overall political process in this country. So we cannot be satisfied. In terms of looking at liberalism versus conservatism, well, let me just say this, that no need of me going into the definition of terms. You know what a conservative is, one who sticks to tradition and patterns, who is very conservative in their attitudes and thoughts and philosophies. You know what a liberal is, a person who is open-minded and responsive to the needs of people in many instances. But we could debate that over and over tonight. But I contend to you that America is becoming more and more conservative in this day and time. And the real test to determine how well a nation is serving the needs of her people is in terms of how well that nation is meeting and taking care of those people who cannot take care of themselves. We must measure America in terms of how well she's taking care of her citizens, those in the dawn of life, her children, those who are in the twilight of life, those who are sick and afflicted, and those who are in the evening and the sundown of their lives, the elderly and the old. And I contend that this conservative America that we are faced with today is not doing an adequate job of addressing the real needs of our people in this nation. And so I say to you that blacks, in terms of one-party voting, I just don't think that that is the answer. I think that we've got to be flexible. Floyd McKissick and I chair a national committee called the National Committee for a Two-Party System in this country. And the concept of this committee, which consists of Democrats and Republicans, Floyd McKissick being a Republican and yours truly being a Democrat, the concept here is that those of us who are black, regardless of whether or not we're Democrat or Republican, then we ought to have some common goals and some common issues facing us as black people. So therefore, the concept of the two-party committee is that under a Republican administration, first of all, we don't think that either party has been as responsive as they ought to have been in terms of meeting the needs of poor women and elderly and disadvantaged people in this country. So we have to send a message first to both parties that we are not satisfied with them. We must say to the Democratic Party that we are tired of the Democratic Party taking us for granted, and tired of the Republican Party ignoring us. We think that both parties need to become more responsive. Secondly, we must have the capability as black people in this country. Under a Republican administration, black Democrats must be able to rise above their party difference and work with those black Republicans who are in a position to be able to relate to a Republican administration. And 3 years from now, when the Democrats get back in office, those black Republicans will be in a position to work through those of us who are black Democrats and who will have a rapport with a Democratic administration. In other words, as black people in this country, as I see it, we must be able to play politics just like white folks. White folks never lose. I don't care who's in office, Democrats or Republicans. The reason they never lose is because they have as many white folks in the Republican Party as they have in the Democratic Party. We must be able to infiltrate and be able to become a part of the decision-making process. It does not mean that we must agree with our brothers who have a Republican philosophy or agree with the platform of the Republican Party. But it does mean that we ought to have the maturity to be able to relate to brothers on common issues regardless of their political party. We must be black first and have a black agenda first and not let parties divide us in terms of what our common interest is. And so we must say to both parties that we as a people will have no permanent friends and no permanent enemies, just permanent interests. And those permanent interests must be whatever is in the best interest of our people. We must be able to penetrate the decision-making process and be active in both parties and to make sure that we are a part of that decision-making process. Let me sum it up by saying this. I could come up here and give you a lecture about liberalism and conservatism and about the plan to do this and that. Well, I don't profess to have all the answers. I will share with you over the next minute some of the areas that I, for one, as an individual, will be working in toward for during the 80s and as we move into the future. Because we must all work toward trying to bring about justice and equality in the nation. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference must continue to be the moral conscience of this nation. The NAACP must continue to stand strong in the legal arena of this country to make sure that we gain justice and equality in that arena. Operation Push, under the leadership of Jesse Jackson, must continue its assault against corporate America, the great corporate interests in this country that are making billions of dollars from the black community and the minority community and not reinvesting, nor are they equally distributing that wealth among blacks and other minorities in this country. PUSH must continue its assault through a withdrawal of enthusiasm in terms of our spending our money with those institutions. And so the Urban League and OIC must continue its thrust in the 80s of training our people for jobs, because our people will work if they have an opportunity to work. And so there are many ways that we will pursue justice and equality. One of the ways that we will be pursuing it is through the National Conference of Black Mayors. Our goal is to try to elect over the next decade over 300 mayors who are black in this nation. It is essential that we control cities in this nation. And I agree with Councilman Blackwell that the concept of federalism makes a lot of sense. As a matter of fact, revenue sharing is perhaps the best example of the new federalism. It makes sense. But if the administration is really serious about getting decision-making down to the local government, if they're concerned about cutting red tape, if they're concerned about federalism working, then send the money to the cities rather than to the states. For we are in a much better position, and most city governments do have at least some representation of blacks and other minorities as opposed to state governments. That, in my opinion, would really be a good example of the new federalism. So over the next decade, the National Conference of Black Mayors, which represents some 200 mayors and $1 million budget, through that budget we propose to try to provide assistance to our mayors and city council members in cities across this nation. Number two, we are going to move to the international front. White people in this country try to define our territory. That's nonsense. Don't let anybody define our territory. The real key for black survival in the 80s is for black people in this country to link with blacks in the Middle East and Africa. Therefore, Dick Hatcher and myself are heading a committee which will go to the OAU this summer for the purpose of getting the Organization of African Unity to do the same as the National Conference of Black Mayors has done, adopt a resolution calling for the twinning of 205 black cities in America headed by black mayors with 205 cities in Africa headed by mayors in Africa. We feel that if we can develop that kind of brotherhood, that kind of basic goodwill, then out of that will grow economic development, import and export opportunities, as well as opportunities for us to exchange culture, interwoven with economic opportunities. For example, out of that kind of relationship has grown an effort in Tuskegee, Alabama, where we're working on the construction of a $500 million oil refinery being built by a black man, which will rely upon very heavily from oil coming from African nations. But it's these kinds of economic projects which grow out of our developing a linkage and a strong relationship with our African cities and our African brothers. We must learn that there is enough money and economics in Africa. If it is linked with the technology and the know-how that we have in the United States, then we can begin to become more self-sustaining. Black America must become economically self-sustaining if we're ever going to be on parity with white America. And finally, we must work towards an active two-party system in this country in order for us to really penetrate the decision-making process in this country. Let me challenge you by saying this. I don't have to say this to you because I know all of you already are. But my challenge to young blacks in Harvard and other schools and colleges across this nation is that when you walk across that stage on graduation day, that in your hand you will grasp a diploma. In one hand, I am hopeful that in the other hand you will have a voter registration card. A diploma which represents brain power, a voter registration card which represents political power. A combination of those two will help us make life much better for our people in the 80s. I challenge black America in the 80s that we must turn to others, to each other, rather than own one another. We must pull together and support and work together if we are ever expected to be able to compete with white America. Thank you so very much, and I look forward to your questions.
last but certainly not least, we would like to have Ms. Diane Penderhughes come forward and give us yet one other perspective. Diane?
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. Clyde Nora called me last week and had some questions he wanted me to answer. They included what resources would bring restoration of two-party politics as far as the black community is concerned, what causes blacks to exhibit block voting patterns, and can block voting be used in other ways, is the new black conservatism a vehicle for increasing black political power and ultimately for improving social conditions, and what kind of assessment could I make of black attitudes towards politics and the political process? And then he said he wanted that in 20 minutes. Okay, well, I'll give you what I can, but obviously I'm not going to answer all of those questions in detail. I could talk for months as my students know. I'll talk first about the resource questions to bring a restoration of two-party politics to the black community and the issue about block voting patterns. Race structures and shapes political interaction in a number of significant ways. As a variable, race has both passive and active modes. In its passive mode, thank you. In its passive mode, it defines and constrains black experience in general and black political and economic participation in particular. In the active mode, it produces in blacks a much more complex set of political requirements and beliefs than is the case among whites. Whites need only focus on their economic interests, and these have generally taken the form of narrowly based economic interests, in other words, interest group activities, rather than broad class interests. Blacks, on the other hand, because of the pressures and restrictions to which they have been subject, must consider two dimensions in their evaluation of political parties, programs, and candidates. First, they have to consider attitudes towards race, whether the state recognizes civil rights for blacks, and how aggressively the state intervenes to protect those rights. Secondly, what kind of attitude do politicians and political parties take towards economic issues? Because racial discrimination also incorporates economic restraints. Blacks must consider the extent to which political programs incorporate liberal economic reform. Some of you are no doubt thinking that is no longer true for the black middle class whose income is comparable to whites. But when we compare wealth as well as income, the black-white economic disparities continue, and I'll give you some examples. In about 1970, blacks had about 18% of white wealth. In other words, of all the wealth in the country, if you compare black wealth and white wealth, black wealth was about 18% of whites. A black economist, Marcus Alexis, showed that of the wealth blacks are likely to hold, it's likely to be held in assets such as real property, houses. About 90% of blacks hold their wealth in terms of property. Whites, on the other hand, hold their wealth more frequently, or less frequently in terms of real property, and more frequently in terms of financial assets, the ratio being about 30% of the financial assets of whites are held in form of liquid paper, for example, stocks, bonds, those sorts of things. And only 10% of that kind of wealth is held by blacks. Now, if you compare all of the real property in the United States and then look at what percentage of that blacks hold, it's 2.6% as of 1970. In other words, of the 100% of all wealth or all real property in a society, blacks hold 2.6% of that, and 0.7% of financial assets. So we've got a long way to go when it comes to comparability as far as wealth is concerned. Income, we've been catching up a little bit, but not by any means in terms of wealth. What that means in political terms, when we look at the economic factors and we look at the racial factors, is that blacks vote in blocks because only one of the parties appeals to them at any one time. This is also the answer to the first question as to the restoration of two-party politics among blacks. Well, there's never been any two-party politics among blacks. at any point in American history. Between 1860 and 1933, the Republican Party allied with blacks, and blacks were very strongly supportive of the Republican Party. That alliance was based on large industrialist or capitalist opposition to the use of slave labor. They were anti-slavery, but they were not pro-integration at the same time. So there was a certain amount of support for increased status of blacks in the society, but they weren't willing to go very far with that. Between 1933 and 1960, there was a kind of transition period with northern blacks shifting to the Democratic Party, which laid the economic basis for integration through the New Deal, for political integration through the New Deal. The Republicans, on the other hand, began to look towards the South, so that the kind of traditional black-Republican alliance began to dissolve. And Republicans as well opposed the economic basis for the New Deal, which meant that the kind of sympathy that blacks felt for the Roosevelt-led Democratic Party was undermined as far as the Republicans were concerned, because they were unwilling to focus on economic kinds of support for the poor, and which would also affect the black population. Between 1960 and the present, the Democratic Party has laid the political basis for an attack on racial issues and has carried that out, has implemented that. Southern conservatives, on the other hand, have begun to move into the Republican Party. What you have then is that you have a very conservative Republican Party on both economic and racial issues, and you have a Democratic Party which is relatively liberal on economic and racial issues. I'm having trouble with this. Okay. The answer to the question on black bloc voting, then, is that only one of the parties appeals to blacks, the Democratic Party. Though it's hardly radical on either racial or economic issues, it makes a clear appeal on both these dimensions. The Republican Party, on the other hand, is hostile in both of those areas, and I don't think I need to give very much elaboration of that for you to know what I'm talking about. I think both of the speakers earlier made some interesting kinds of linkages to the things I've said, namely that blacks are sensitive across all class lines to these kinds of issues. Ken Blackwell made the point that whether you're liberal or conservative, whether you're Democrat or Republican, you have to deal with racial issues. An example of that, a recent example of that, is a referendum that was held in Washington, D.C. this past November, when the issue of educational or tuition tax credits was raised and was put on the ballot. There was some question as to whether the black middle class would be willing to support such a thing, and the expectation was that it would support it because many of them have children in either Catholic schools or private schools. But the opponents in the campaign raised and successfully attached the issue of race to the question of tuition tax credits. And as a consequence, the voter outcome was such that there was about an 8-to-1 vote against supporting that type of activity. Now, public spokesmen such as Thomas Sowell have argued that the black community is misrepresented by many liberal black organizations because they emphasize public sector activity, they exercise expenditure of public funds, that things such as tuition tax credits or educational vouchers or private sector activity are actually supported more often in the black community, and that there's a misrepresentation of black attitudes. Well, when you look at political polling, for example, by the Gallup organization, you find that Sowell and President Reagan misrepresent black attitudes to a great extent. That in the case of busing, in February of 1981, the Gallup organization questioned blacks and whites on whether they were in favor of busing to achieve better racial balance. Blacks supported busing 59% in 59% of the cases of the respondents. They were opposed to busing as far as 31% of the respondents. Whites were significantly, in fact, a vast majority, about 80% of the whites opposed it. There was some difference in the North and the South among blacks, but there was very strong support in both the North and the South In the case of, let's see, I have some other examples here. Affirmative action, for example, which is another one that Sol is always harping on. Whites oppose it 87% to 7%. Blacks are not supportive in a majority, but 29% of blacks support affirmative action versus 7% for whites. Now, that's not a majority, but as a general principle, if you ask blacks, in effect, they say, no, we don't support it. But that's first, there are two points I need to make on that. First is it's a much higher percentage of the black population that supports it than whites. And secondly, were you to give blacks a specific instance, for example, some one individual in this situation, if they were not able to get a job because of racial discrimination, and whether or not they would then accept a job as a result of a particular program, I predict that the representation would increase to a majority. So as a general principle, blacks might oppose affirmative action, but in specific kinds of instances, they would be supportive of it. Busing, on the other hand, they're very supportive. All right, now to answer the question as to whether how block voting will end, it'll occur under two circumstances. Number one, when neither the racial or the economic dimensions affect blacks so acutely as they do at present, and or, secondly, the Republican Party seeks to address these problems through specific policy recommendations. In other words, Republicans such as Bill Brock maybe 3 or 4 years ago, Ronald Reagan in his past, most recent election, have argued that they support blacks participating in the Republican Party. But when pressed for their policy statements or their program issues on which they might win black support, they're not able to produce any that would be, shall we say, attractive in the black community. Blacks vote for specific and for logical reasons. And unless Republicans can address blacks along either racial lines and or economic lines, they're not going to win very much support. I think those two factors, if you use those as a kind of measure, they help answer the third and fourth questions. Is the new black conservatism a vehicle for increasing black political power and improving social conditions? I think the answer is no, because it assumes, first of all, a primary reliance on the private sector. That's flawed because the private sector is not free of racism, which you'd have to assume would be the case if the private sector is going to be the solution to the problems of the black community. And it's also not clear what the source of black economic resources will be in this new day when black enterprise will arise from somewhere. It's not clear at this point. It also assumes that the public sector is necessarily flawed, both in terms of intent and in its ability to implement particular programs. Certainly there are many programs that have had difficulties. We all know about the problems of implementation, but the fact is that the public sector has borne the major responsibility for implementing racial reform in the society. In the early 1960s, Hobart Taylor, a former member of the board of the NAACP and a black businessman who was very wealthy in his own right, who was very much in favor of private enterprise, articulated the interests of the business community, which began to encourage racial integration, which began to encourage breakdown of some types of racial barriers. But that occurred only as a result of the intervention of the federal government. So you had a kind of shift in the concerns of the private sector to which the federal government was responsive and which the federal government carried out that particular kind of political change. All right, now I'm going to conclude on an assessment of black attitudes towards politics and the political process and make a very few comments about my recommendations for the kinds of things blacks can do. In recent years, black politicians have used something I call electoral lobbying to have an impact on, to attempt an impact on officials, predominantly white officials. If you remember during the Carter administration, when there was an attempt on the part of the Congressional Black Caucus to pass the Humphrey Hawkins bill, the Black Caucus used what's a kind of well, what I've already mentioned, electoral lobbying to try and get that passed. That's simply saying, walking into a particular official and saying, well, we supported you in 1976. If you don't do what we want you to, we will not support you in 1980. That's using both a threat and a promise, using both the past and the future at the same time. The difficulty is that if you threaten somebody in 1977 or 1978, when 1980 comes around, you may find, as is always the case, that you have no other partisan alternative, and the threat is a weak and an ineffective threat. Electoral lobbying, therefore, is something that black politicians have used, and I think have used ineffectively. What it means is that black politicians as individuals, black citizens as represented in groups of individuals, interest groups, community organizations, need to be more active in contacting black political officials or contacting officials in general. I used to argue that the reason that blacks were not very influential in policy implementation was because they had few organizations. That's not true. It turns out that blacks are, in fact, more organized than whites when you consider class and education and occupation and all sorts of things. But they score lowest in all of those activities in terms of contacting political officials. In other words, they organize, they have meetings, they meet in communities, they, to a certain extent, contribute to political organizations. Many blacks belong to many more organizations than a typical white person. But in general, they fall down in terms of actually going into someone's office and saying, this is what I feel about a particular issue. I think that is one of the areas that we can begin to make some effort at changing. It involves a kind of re-socialization in terms of our thinking of how we interact with the political sector. Specific events that are important, and I have to second Mayor Johnny Ford on this, of the passage of the Voting Rights Act, and another set of activities that are critically important for
the time. And sometimes we have to choose between what we have offered. There were no blacks running in that particular campaign, and to be quite frank about it, you would have to really be in Alabama to compare the difference between what is happening now and what happened 10 or 15 years ago. But in terms of supporting either of those individuals for president again, no way. You live and learn. I'm one of those guys who was man enough to say, one thing about me, I'm very outspoken. I'll say what's on my mind if I make a mistake, and I'm man to say, hey man, I did not think it through. But the point is, as a result of those decisions, our city gained tremendously in terms of economic resources. You just have to see what has happened in our city over the last decade in terms of the millions of dollars in resources that have come from both the federal and the state government. And it's not necessarily being able to deal with particular elected officials, but being able to deal with the system, regardless of who the president is or who the governor is. Those of us who are mayors have a responsibility to deal with that.
Thank you. This question over here.
Yeah, I'd like to address this to anyone who cares to answer this, but all three of you have said, or most of you said something about blacks being monolithic or blacks not being monolithic, and you've also addressed block voting. And what I want to ask is that it is known that blacks do block vote, so how can we be more effective? I mean, we can vote more, sure, but I mean, if we're all going to vote the same way, and isn't it logical that they're going to discount this vote? I mean, how would blacks be more effective by being a better lobbyist, or if they can count on our vote going one way?
Diane, you want to take that one?
Well, there's so many ways that can be answered. It depends upon the partisan distribution in a town or a city that you're talking about. If the vote is split in that town, if the white vote is split, for example, blacks then become a very critical block. They can swing the results of the election. If whites are, for the most part, pretty certain about supporting one or another candidate, then you have a difficult kind of problem. That's the kind of problem that many jurisdictions encounter where city officials have, for example, gerrymandered districts, or they have created at-large elections to minimize the extent to which blacks can have an impact. But I think when you have a situation where the vote is close, where whites are not quite sure who they're going to vote for, or there's a relatively even distribution between, say, white Democrats and white Republicans, which is not all that unusual, then blacks become important. All right, now, if you assume you have a certain amount of division in the vote, blacks become important. Then, in between elections, you then have to use the lobbying arm very effectively. Or say you do have a situation where whites control the vote, or at least are a voting majority, and that's not the same thing as saying that blacks could not get to the point of having a voting majority. You could use intervention in between elections to put a lot of pressure on those particular political officials. Increasing lobbying participation would then also tend to increase turnout at the end of that electoral period. That's something I haven't thought about before, but I think it would work that way. That's an answer. Maybe there's some other comments.
Mr. Blackwell, would you like to also respond to that one?
Again, I'll use my specific situation and jump to a general application. In 1980, I was a member of a local political party called the Charter Party in Cincinnati. We have three parties, the two national parties and the Charter Party. The Charter Party is made up of moderate Democrats and moderate Republicans on the state and national level, but they have a local focus in municipal politics. I decided to affiliate locally with the Republican Party as well as nationally and statewide. It was interesting, the fallout. I got calls from black Democrats and black Charterites saying you ought to do this on a weekly basis because we haven't been called on such a regular basis by the party headquarters as we have been since your decision to go with the Republican Party. It was an obvious situation in Cincinnati that the description that Mayor Ford gave you, where one party was taking the black vote for granted and the other party was ignoring it, existed. And it took some movement, some risk, in order to get things at least moving. But I think it is important to tie back into something that Dr. Penahue said, and that is the degree of recognition within the political parties that it is in their interest to broaden their base. Now, I've visited the White House on 4 different occasions since Mr. Reagan has been there, and on all 4 occasions, I've sensed that there are 2 camps within the White House. Those folks with their feet on the door saying, we didn't need you to get here, and other folks saying that we want to be a majority party in this country and we want to be a majority party for a long time. I guess they come out of the Bronx school, and consequently they're saying we want to be more responsive to non-traditional Republicans. Well, again, now we've set up a situation where there is at least an element for change within the responsiveness within the Republican Party that I can respond to, and I now have a burden of trying to exploit that responsiveness for my constituents. So I went right back to Cincinnati on all 4 occasions, dealt with the principal Republican forces, and I do believe that we have to pull on our diversity and that black conservatives have something to offer. We looked at a CETA program that was failing the citizens of Cincinnati. As a matter of fact, it was the ultimate in trickle down. When we looked at where the money was going, how the money was being used, who was employed and who was still unemployed, the hardcore unemployables for whom the money was targeted were still left out in the cold. So I turned to the corporate sector in Cincinnati and said, hey, through a system of import substitution, can we begin to expand the black economic base. Import substitution is a simple economic term for saying to Procter & Gamble, General Electric, Federated Department Stores, how much of what you need for your manufacturing purposes do you go outside of Cincinnati to get? How much of that could be made here in Cincinnati? For instance, the plastic tops on Pringles. We then went to the Cincinnati banking community. We said that we will challenge every acquisition you attempt by using the 1976 Banking Act. And if you don't begin to become a little more liberal in your lending practices, and now we have a situation where Procter & Gamble, a multinational corporation, is saying to a black businessman, you can manufacture Pringle tops for us. We know that that accounts receivable slip, it's money in the bank. Will you lend this person money? That began to work. And we know, I know, at least in Cincinnati, and again, that's going from the specific to the general, that the solution to the unemployment problem that faces the black community is found in not only business expansion in general, but minority business opportunity and expansion specifically. So again, bringing the economic and the political together, saying that yes, I do think that we have to exploit opportunities to return competitive politics, or at least create them. If Dr. Penhughes is right that we've never had it, I think that has to be one of our essential goals.
Thank you, Ken. Next question.
Yes, I don't believe I heard any mention of the National Black Independent Party, political party, or any type of effort like that, except in your, possibly in your remarks about the charter party, which is local. And I'm wondering what that means, or maybe I missed somebody's remark or aside on that. But I'm wondering what that means. That does that mean that the National Black Independent Political Party, as a type of tactic, is not relevant in you all's opinion? Will it not be able to? Will that type of effort not be able to reach black people? Be used as a tool, separated from either the allying with the Democratic or Republican parties?
Yeah. I guess mine was an oversight. As a matter of fact, it's listed right here. When I said Democrat, Republican, member of the Socialist Workers Party, or a member of the Independent National Black Party. Again, I think that just reflects the diversity of political thought in the black community, and it would be foolhardy for anybody to exclude it from his or her thinking. I think it is a very valuable, not only tactic, but it's a very valuable constituency that black elected officials have, because it probably represents a growing sense of not only estrangement from two existing national parties, but independence from. And I think it's healthy.
Question over here.
I'd like to address this question to Mr. Blackwell and Mr. Ford, who both emphasized in their conclusion that participation is the bottom line for blacks working through the political process in the 1980s. And I'm wondering about that strategy and how it is to be implemented when you look at the apathy that pervades black people in working through the political process. Now, I think that apathy is due to three forces. One, you have a growing class antagonism, so you don't see black people with common interest, or at least lower class and middle class interests are diverging. And then you have a government policy which emphasizes military spending over social programs, so they look at that and say, why should we indeed participate in the political process when it's not going to bring us anything? So I was just wondering, how are you going to counter those historical and psychological forces to bring forth this participation?
I clearly believe that participation in the political process is absolutely essential. Blacks and other minorities and women have never really gotten anything in this country unless they've stood up and fought for it and protested for it and voiced their opposition to existing administration. I'm a firm believer that the pendulum swings from right to left in this country, from conservatism to liberalism. I'm a strong believer that without agitation, there's no progress. We started out a good example of about 30 or 40 blacks in the snow in this march in Alabama for the Voting Rights Act, about 30 of us. But by the time we reached Montgomery, Alabama, we had over 50, 60,000 blacks and whites who became a part of that movement. So what I'm saying to you is that you've just got to be persistent. Somebody's got to be the moral conscience of this nation, and history will bear out that agitation, protest, speaking out, resisting has been an answer for us. And that's not the total answer. It must be a combination of all of us. We must pursue justice and equality through protest and demonstration. We must pursue it through the legal channels. We must pursue it through the economic channels, the educational channels, the religious channels. It must be a diversified approach, but certainly participation in the political and the decision-making process is an absolute must if change is to come in this country.
I tried to allude to what I saw as a strategy for increasing participation in my remarks when I identified the lack of participation as being a problem. I think we have to begin on the most basic level. Perhaps it's the neighborhood or community as opposed to the municipal. But I think that you have to work for short-term, highly visible successes, whether it's people realizing that they can have an effect on their local government and get potholes filled, or get a health clinic or a recreation center in their neighborhoods. That's why I was saying that I think one of the positive possibilities of the new federalism, or at least a modification in our federal system, is that if we begin to push more and more responsibilities and give more and more authority back to the local level, people will know that they can hold local officials accountable and that their participation in that local process has some meaning. I think right now most people don't participate, not because they are innately or intuitively apathetic, but because they really don't think that it's going to make a difference whether or not you have a liberal or a conservative, a Democrat or a Republican in there, because these are not the folks that you can ultimately hold accountable. What I realize or experience on a daily basis is that most folks, when talking with the mayor or a city council member, basically believe that the mayor or city council member is nothing but an extension of the business establishment in the city, a puppet, if you will. Most people believe that most major decisions that affect employment, health, and some other basic problem areas are made either by the business community or by the Congress or the state legislature, and so they are not involved at the local level. I think we have to scale it down, and we have to go to the neighborhood, and we have to go to the municipal level. Let me say this, that, and it kind of ties the two questions together. Charles Summer once said that if you live in a country that is run by a committee, make sure you're on that committee. I happen to believe that, and I think that instinctively most black folks believe that. It is our responsibility to help those who don't believe it to believe it, and get them involved at the local level.
Thank you. Diane, you want to take cut at that one too?
A little bit. I think there's another factor, which is that we tend to think you have to create another set of institutions to increased political participation, that you've got to organize little local Democratic clubs or local Republican clubs or some kind of political parties. I think one of the things that is clear from the civil rights movement is that it became effective when local religious institutions were mobilized, when it was possible for civil rights workers to go into a black community and find some institutional support. And until that was possible, and unless that was possible in certain towns, it was very difficult because, of course, all of the white institutions were rabidly against their entry. At the North, I think, in the North and in the country as a whole, I think there are lots of existing community institutions, fraternal associations, sororities, church organizations that can be used not entirely for political purposes, but that can be used selectively, because you'd burn them out if you used them all the time. But in cities like Washington, D.C., which have something called civic associations, I've been trying to talk to my parents for a long time to get them to start using those as if they are the equivalent of a political machine. They're, for the most part, talk about crime problems, talk about trash pickup, those sorts of things. But at the same time, it's easy to transform that into a kind of organization where you send an individual to a city council member or to some political official at the local level to say, we have these certain kinds of problems. How about you come down and talk to us, or let's sit down at some point and deal with these. I think that's another way of talking about increased participation, which instead of thinking of politics as some large, formal, structured sort of thing, to use those institutions that already exist.
Thank you.
Thank you. Question over here.
I'd like to address my question to Dr. Penderhughes as a political theorist and to Blackwell as a politician. It sort of ties into the last comments you made. And what I want to say is, our ability to survive as a people has been ascribed by many to our ability to organize around family and community for effective problem solving. Can you characterize, and how do you characterize, our inability to use this kind of organizational power to effectively impact on the political system in our country? And finally, what are your theories, or what theories are you familiar with in terms of political behavior that can be applied to new kind of learning for blacks in the 80s to more effectively use this group behavior for political action? And as I said, I would want to know if there are political theories which explain this that can direct us. And from Mr. Blackwell, how can we use whatever theories are available to more effectively utilize our group-forming ability to impact on the political system?
Does it matter to you which one goes first?
Not really, no.
Okay.
It seems logical the theory might first precede the behavior.
Well, I guess the most appropriate literature would be political socialization, and that tends to emphasize that black children's political socialization is somewhat different than white children's, as we might expect. That at about age 6 or 7, when they reach a certain amount of political maturity and they develop a sense of what political authorities are, white children tend to increase their affect for political symbols, the flag, the president, local policeman, positive affect, that is. Black children, on the other hand, exhibit a certain negative reaction to those symbols. There was a study done in Philadelphia in the 1960s that showed there was a kind of separation. At a certain point, I think in high school, black children's positive support for those symbols began to rise again, but there was a period when they were alienated from the political system because they received communication from their parents that there was some negative impact of that political system upon them as a family. In terms of what that may mean is that some of the difficulty we've been talking about, that is in terms of voting turnout, may help to reduce levels of participation in formal electoral institutions and may encourage blacks to participate in protests and demonstrations rather than the conventional legitimate, so-called legitimate political or electoral system. The question is whether we want to change that. And that's something that you can't make a group decision on. It's something that is done in individual families all over the country. We don't yet have a black think tank that thinks about those kinds of issues and then generates money and projects to think about how we might re-socialize the black community. And that's a question.
Do you see the PACT alternative as something that blacks could develop in order to become more political and participate to a greater extent?
You mean the Political Action Committee, like the
yes,
the
having
one-
some kind of that kind of model for use in the black community, where we organize around political issues, is the way we do around the things you just mentioned, like the trash not being picked up, etc.
Are you talking about the kind that was started by the Congressional Black Caucus?
Well, something like that, but more on a more local level, where you can have
Local
participation at the grassroots level.
Well, I think a substantive political action committee where you talk about issues. The one at the national level is really created to generate money from business corporations. And the expectation is that it will get a good deal of money, and that's nice to have, but it involves a certain political loading of what those corporations are going to expect. If you talk about a political action committee that's focused less on eliciting money from some business community than it is on deciding, for example, what kinds of issues might be appropriate to be handled in Cincinnati or in Tuskegee, sure, I think it's a good idea. And it's really, the problem with that is that it's creating another superstructure, and I'm not sure whether we need another one. Part of the reason I think that there may be a certain perception of apathy on the part of blacks is that we all are involved in so many organizations. If you think about, this particular setting, at Harvard, you've got, the Kennedy School student body and Affirmative Action Committee and the Cromwell Cox Steering Committee and the Black Caucus, and every single national college has similar institutions. The Democratic Party has similar institutions. There's just a multitude of these kinds of things all over, and it requires a good deal of time and thinking and money to organize them all, and we're all sort of running around. And a lot of things, I think, fall between the cracks. So I think maybe using existing institutions and just politicizing them a little more than we have been, it's a sort of an intermediate kind of answer.
Thank you.
The challenge is to move from the theory now to the practical. One of the practical problems that we have in terms of motivating people, I'll say again, is the fact that if people can anticipate a negative consequence, even if they participate, then they choose not to waste their time. Therefore, the art of governing and leading is a matter of showing people where their involvement in the process will result in a more positive consequence than they are anticipating. Again, I come back to, and it's going to be my theme, scaling it down, looking at those things that are possible to do and that will give you short-term success that you can build upon, whether it's working through an established community council, a sorority or fraternity, the Masonic order, what have you, a church. Secondly, I think, just as Dr. Penderhughes has said, being able to deal with with themes that motivate is important. I think sometimes we overstate the liberalism that exists in the black community. Now, I know I'm from Cincinnati, and I know you know what Mark Twain said about Cincinnati, that what he said after visiting Cincinnati is that if he got word that the world was going to end tomorrow, he would get to Cincinnati as fast as he could, because things happen in Cincinnati 10 years after they happen in the rest of the world. Maybe it is wrong for me to use Cincinnati as an example, but nonetheless, I think the black community on social issues, socially, in terms of social values, might be more conservative than we give the black community credit for. And let me just give you a practical example. A lot of my colleagues automatically reject everything Jerry Falwell says, and a lot of you might give them a lot of credit for having good sense. But what they reject and what they throw out when they reject Jerry Falwell is a recognition that while maybe his doctrinaire, dogmatic, narrow way of approaching a problem does not negate the fact that there is a certain religiousness tradition in the black community that provides an opportunity for organizing, and that there are issues, social issues that involve the building of moral character that a lot of black people can relate to, and that sometimes we don't pluck the right chord or advance the right theme, and we miss a substantial number of black people in terms of motivating them to get involved. But that is a challenge for political leadership. So scaling it down, quick successes, I think is the formula for increasing participation.
We have one last question over here.
All right. I'll address this to any panelists. I think a major problem for black Americans and all Americans really is the appalling unemployment among teenage blacks. I'd like to ask you if you agree with the Republican solution that the minimum wage ought to be lowered, or what solution can you offer?
I'll go on since I'm the only Republican on the panel. At least today. Do I agree with the Republican strategy? I think that we should rethink the minimum wage. I think that we should look at possibly establishing a sub-minimum wage policy. I think that when you look at who the minimum wage impacts most severely, it happens to be the least experienced and the least skilled. And that happens to be, in a lot of situations, poor minority teenagers. The fear that most labor people have and most opponents to this rethinking of the minimum wage policy is that we will go through a significant period of substitution. We will hire sons and fire fathers. That's, I don't think, I think it's a problem, but I think it's over-exaggerated as to the severity of the problem. I don't think that it is cost-efficient for a business to hire a low-skilled, non-experienced worker to do something that is generally calls for skills and some experience. I don't think that company could survive. Now, again, you might find some sweatshop operators that still exist in contemporary America who will attempt it, but I really do think that we ought to kind of rethink it.
As a Democrat, I disagree. No problem. Some of my best friends are Republicans. Seriously, as a mayor, for example, in the rural South, Alabama's unemployment is 14%, highest it's ever been in the history of the state. Unemployment among black youth is the #1 problem. Unemployment, period, is the #1 problem facing blacks and minorities in this country. I just think that the nation has its priorities mixed up. I just think that the minimum wage needs to stay where it is. I just think that we need to allocate additional resources to put people back to work in terms of public service and public work jobs. I think that those programs could be administered more effectively. If the administration is sincere about federalism, then through a revenue sharing concept, make block grants available to cities so that cities can deal with the unemployment problems in their cities. To rely so solely upon the private sector to meet this obligation just has proven not to be effective in this country. So I just think that this unemployment problem is being approached from the wrong approach.
Let me just say that I would not disagree of the top priority status of the unemployment problem. But I do know, just from a practical standpoint, one of the things that Walter didn't list in the biographical statement is that I, for the last 7 years, been in the coal mining business. And I know, as a small business person, that when you're faced with a choice of either going to a skeleton staff or moving towards automation or paying the minimum wage, more and more businesses are not opting for paying the minimum wage to people that they feel are not experienced and not skilled, and consequently turning towards skeleton crews or automation. That is not helping the unemployment problem in this country. I don't think that a sub-minimum wage policy would be the catch-all or the ultimate solution to the unemployment problem. I personally think that as a council member and a former mayor of a major U.S. city, that the Reagan administration really is going to have to do it or get off the pot around the urban enterprise zones. One of the things that we are witnessing in Cincinnati is that our manufacturing base is shrinking. There is a growth in high technology industries. There is a growth in service and financial industries. Consequently, those are not the areas that the semi-skilled and non-skilled hardcore unemployables can use for entry-level purposes, which leaves us with what I consider to be an absurd option, but nonetheless it is there, and that is what one Carter Commission stated. It was the commission on the agenda for the 80s. They said that we had placed too much effort on investing in regions or places, and that we needed to shift our policy focus to investing in people. So they said, don't invest in Cincinnati because it is losing its competitive advantages and jobs are going to the Sun Belt or overseas to West Germany or Japan. Invest in people and, in fact, transport those people from Cincinnati to where the job opportunities are. I labeled that the bus ticket strategy to solving the unemployment problem. The question is whether or not we in Midwestern and Northeastern mature cities can afford not to have some sort of targeted effort to, one, retain our manufacturing base, and two, have some sort of incentive structure that will bring some of that industry back to those ailing cities, because black people are now 70% plus urban, and they happen to be living in a good measure in these sections of the country where the industrial base is declining rapidly, and I don't see any other solution than that kind of targeting effort being able to bring some easing to the unemployment problem.
How'd you know that, man? Where'd you read that? You're pretty hip for a white boy. How'd you know that?
I want to make one comment. I think that question it puts us between a rock and a hard place, because lowering the minimum wage may bring about some of the issues you raise, and economists, as usual, don't agree on what the outcome will be, and it's very hard to predict whether you'll end up with more unemployment among older workers who have fewer skills, and whether you'll solve teenage unemployment at the same time, whether you'll end up with pushing unemployment further up in the age structure. At the same time, if the whole question of the lowering of the minimum wage is raised by the migration of so many jobs overseas because of the whole question of hourly wage cost and the fact that it's lower in Brazil and Argentina and various places. But, what do you do? I mean, we can't lower the cost of living in the country by 50% as a whole in order to accommodate that. I mean, you're really caught. That's one point, and that's simply to raise the question. It doesn't give you any answers. The point about that Carter Commission, which recommended, removing investment from places and putting it in people, that happened to have been a fluke in that it was at the very end of the Carter administration. That was a conclusion that was pushed through by one of those commissioners who happened to have been a professor at some university in Texas by chance. And so he had something to gain from that. And then finally on the urban enterprise zones, I think that's possibly a very dangerous policy, because what it seems to me to suggest is an agreement to simply withdraw any rules and regulations from certain geographical sectors in our cities, which will coincide with the high black density, which is like creating slave labor camps, frankly. I mean, it's a very strong language, but I think that's really what we're talking about here. The problems, some of the other problems is it's not going to bring in high technology. The workers do not have a lot of skills. The kind of high technology that the people who are proposing it are talking about require very large investments of capital. That's not going to happen. There's a big question as to whether those will actually produce something positive or whether they'll just make it easy for people to bring in a certain amount of very low cost, get involved in very low cost labor and have a detrimental rather than a beneficial effect on the black community. So I question that one also.
Thank you all very much. On behalf of the Black Caucus and the Kennedy
Might I ask
School.
one question, perhaps, if the panel is okay with the panel? Sorry about that, but I couldn't resist.
We were quick.
As black students, many of us are in higher learning institutions, and at the end of that, we hopefully have had a number of experiences and exposures to assume a certain political posture, some of which may be influenced by white people in black skin, or perhaps black racists. My question to you, and perhaps I'd like to start with Mr. Blackwell, is to explain your position that you have assumed as a strategy for the 80s of the zigzag pragmatist, and perhaps if each of you following could maybe kind of label yourselves and how you think that applies for the future.
Well, I guess in simple and philosophical terms, as this country goes through a redefinition of process in terms of defining what a liberal conservative might be or what they are, I see a pragmatist as having an ideal, meaning that a pragmatist understands what the ideal state of affairs would be, and then takes a very practical way of to get to these ends. That's why I am not, one African proverb that I keep center most of my thinking is that when the elephants are at war, it is the grass that suffers. So I don't get bogged down into any heady discussion with people about whether or not they're Democrats or Republicans or conservatives or liberals. I do look at whether or not our permanent interests or our common interests are there, and how we can meet those objectives in a very practical way. We are talking about private-public partnerships. We're talking about all kinds of partnerships to affect a better world. I think black folks better start with being partners with one another and get beyond those pseudo-labels if we're going to improve our conditions.
In my instance, I'm just a plain old boy from the South, seriously one who grew up in the shadows of Booker T. Washington and his philosophy in Tuskegee, one who believes in penetrating the system and once within the system, try to cause that system to become more responsive and to change that system to make it and cause it to become responsive to the needs of our people. In order to do that, you have to, in many instances, compromise, negotiate, but never losing sight of your common goal. And that common goal is the welfare and the benefit of your people. It means that you have to deal with some people whom you don't necessarily agree with in terms of their philosophical principles or in terms of their political positions. But as a practical politician, sometimes you have to do whatever's in the best interest of your people. You must never lose sight in terms of what is in the best interest of your people. So I think that Booker T. Washington, perhaps more so than any other leader during the last century, is one whom I respect and in many instances follow much of his concept.
And I'm someone who's interested in how race and economics impact on politics. Thank you.
Well, Walter, let me just, because that was a damn good question. Let me just give you a couple of examples that I want to put on all the students. You know, I listen to Thomas Sowell, and Tom feels at times that the only way that he can find some legitimacy as a black leader is by attacking Jesse Jackson, Benjamin Hooks, and right on down the line. In all fairness to him, at times Jesse Jackson, Benjamin Hooks, and what have you tried to reinforce their established legitimacy by attacking a Thomas Sowell. But when we stop and think about something, let me just give you an example. You know, since 1954 and beyond, we've been fighting segregated schools in this country. I think Barbara Sizemore says it more clearly than anybody that I've heard state the case, that if you are not talking about integration where there is a context for freedom of choice without any false or artificial barriers being placed in people's way, for instance, on the basis of race, desegregation and segregation can be the flip side of the same coin. You can go to any major metropolitan school district in this country, but I've studied the 11-state southern region, and it just amazed me when I looked at how in North Carolina, where a desegregation solution was pursued, that we now find ourselves in a situation where we only have one black principal in the whole state of North Carolina. Every time schools were consolidated, the black principal either got pushed out onto some soft federal program or became the assistant principal of the now consolidated schools. The push-out phenomena, where black kids who were bused into predominantly white schools got expelled at a much more accelerated pace. What they were experiencing was that it was a new form of racial discrimination, and that desegregation and segregation for them were the flip sides of the same coin. We can find ourselves in an awkward situation where we get into name calling with one another and overlook the circumstances and the consequences of various social actions and social relationships. And in summing up, tell you the difficulty of political leadership in the black community in America today. In 1972 in Gary, Indiana, I thought, what a complex world this is, when Amir Baraka says, I'm against busing because it is a racist assumption to believe that my kids have to be sitting next to a white kid to get a quality education in this country. And the same morning, I had just heard Richard Nixon say, I am against busing. And I said, you know, it's interesting because they have perhaps two different motivations. You know, maybe Nixon's motivation was pure and honest and towards a good end. but it was being perceived and described as being for a negative purpose. But I'm just saying, you have Amir Baraka, a nationalist, saying, I'm against busing because it is based on a racist assumption, and you have Richard Nixon, and then you have the political leader that has to try to decipher as to which direction to move and what is a good versus a negative motivation for that movement.
I think that's a good and stimulating note for us to bring these proceedings to a close, and I want to remind the company here that there is a reception being held in the penthouse this evening, so if you would like to pursue this question or other questions with our panelists in a more informal setting, the reception will take place right after these proceedings. But let me just say, on behalf of the Black Caucus and the Kennedy School, I would like to thank Mr. Ford, Mr. Blackwell, and Ms. Penderhughes for being here with us this evening, and thank you for your stimulating and interesting questions and for coming out this evening.